Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Our apologies for the brief delay in getting started today as we dealt with a technical issue that cropped up, which now thankfully seems to be resolved. We are absolutely delighted to have you with us here at the Vural Center for Global Islamic Studies. My name is Peter Mandaville, and I am the center's director. We are delighted to welcome to the Vural Center today as part of our spring 2022 guest lecture series, Professor Matt Kuiper from Hope College in Michigan. Professor Kuiper has a fantastic new book out looking at the global history of Dawah. And he's going to be offering us a presentation today based, as I understand it, largely on this book. We will hopefully have some opportunity after his presentation for a question and answer and exchange, which it'll be my honor to moderate. And there are various ways that you can participate in that. You can raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand feature. You can just let us know in the chat box that you would like to answer or you'd like to pose a question. So without further ado, particularly given our little delay in getting started, it is my extreme pleasure and honor to hand things over to Professor Kuiper as our featured speaker today. Matt, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mandaville. And can you all hear me and see me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Yes. All right, great. It'd probably be good for participants who are not speaking to mute their microphones. Just a little word of someone who's done a lot of Zoom talking here. So yeah, again, thank you, Professor Mandaville, and the Center for Global Islamic Studies for the invitation to be with you. It's truly an honor. And sorry for the technical difficulties. I'll try to cut some material where I can, so that we can cover a little more of the basis today, but but still have time for Q&A at the end. I want to put up on the screen to start with two opening quotes, just to get our minds moving in the direction that this talk is going. First, from the famous 20th century Salafi scholar Nasiruddin al-Albani. He writes in one place, "Everybody claims that the Prophet is their role model. Our Prophet spent the first half of his message in Mecca making dawah. He did not start it with jihad." And then more recently, from someone whom I've studied a fair bit, the Indian Muslim televangelist Dr. Zakir Naik. He said, "Today the best jihad, according to me, is dawah, conveying the message of Allah to the non-Muslims, removing the misconceptions from their minds." Once again, the title of my talk for today is Muslim Activism in the Modern World, Why Dawah? And there's a double meaning in this question. Most importantly, I want to explore a few of the reasons why Dawah has become a central theme in Muslim activism in the modern world. And in so doing, secondarily, I hope it will become clear why I have found Dawah to be such a compelling lens of analysis through which to study Islamic history, past and present. My research over nearly the past decade has given me the privilege of publishing 2 books on the subject of Dawah, and today's talk draws from both, especially from the more recent book on the right. And I'm going to ask you to pardon the small advertisement here, but since what I can share today is only scratching the surface, I would invite you to please check out the book for much more of the evidence and really nuance which supports the very small snippet I'm presenting here. Also today, I just want to make another point. I will be unavoidably using some big abstractions, things like the Muslim world or Muslims around the world, or what I call Dawah-minded Muslims. But I want to stress that behind these abstractions are human beings. In the course of my research, I have experienced so much warmth and hospitality from Muslim friends around the world who have helped me as I have explored this topic. And so I don't want us to lose sight of that human side. And then one more important thing by way of some preliminaries, just want to give you quickly a couple of key concepts. And by laying these out up front, I hope that we should be able to cover a bit more ground. First, the term dawah itself. Dawah is an Arabic term also found in the classical Islamic tradition, which literally means calling or inviting, as in inviting to Islam. This is the term most frequently used today for Islamic missionary activity. A term that's sometimes used synonymously with this, particularly in the South Asian context, is the word tabligh, literally conveying, as in conveying the message of Islam. Under dawah, I would include two subcategories. First, internal dawah has to do with exhorting or encouraging or seeking to reform and revive fellow Muslims. This tends to be the primary nuance of the way the term is used, but there's a second one that's been growing in prominence, and that is external dawah, or outreach to non-Muslims. Another important term is a term I use is dawahology. I use this to speak of Muslim or Islamic missionary theologies. These can be articulated or unarticulated beliefs and principles that undergird dawah practice. Now, since the Quran is the undisputed starting point for any Islamic dawahology, let me just say a few words quickly about dawah in the Quran. In chapter 1 of the book, I argue that dawah, understood broadly, is not incidental, but actually central to the Quran's purpose and style. Many students of the Quran notice that the Quran has a sermonic quality. That is to say, when one reads the Quran, one often hears the voice of a preacher. In fact, I suggest that one fruitful pathway into the Quran is to view it as God's own dawah, God's invitation or summons given to humanity in light of the last day or the day of judgment. Closely related to this is the fact that the Quranic dawah is set in an interreligious milieu, a contested milieu, which involves, therefore, debate or disputation with Jews, Christians, mushrikeen, and others. So, of many passages from the Quran I could show you, I've just picked out two that are quite commonly cited in the construction of modern dawahologies. And so I just want to show them to you here quickly. One is Surah Al-Imran, verse 104, which says, let there be from among you a community inviting, and the word there in Arabic is the word yad'una, which comes from the same root that gives us the word dawah. Let there be among you a community, yad'una ila al-khair, inviting to the good. And then notice, commanding what is right and forbidding what is wrong. There's a close relationship between dawah and this other classical concept of commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. And that really shows the relationship between dawah and what I just called a minute ago, internal dawah, or seeking to preach to or reform or exhort fellow Muslims. Another verse that's frequently cited in the construction of modern dawahologies is Surah An-Nahl 16:125. This begins with a command. Ad'u, invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good instruction. And then this phrase, very important, wajadilhum, and argue with them in the best way. I think this points to something very important about the Quran. The Quran, one might say, delivers its dawah in a religiously diverse context and anticipates that interreligious encounter and even debate is expected to be a normal part of dawah. Interreligious relations is one of the key lenses I employ in my work on dawah. Now, the final two terms, coming back to this slide, are based on a well-known distinction from within the Islamic tradition itself, the Meccan and Medinan phases of the life of the Prophet. In chapter 2 of my book, I studied the traditional seerah, or biography of the Prophet, looking at how he is depicted doing da'wah in Mecca from 610 to 622, and then in Medina from 622 to 632. Based on an analogy to these two phases and following a number of modern Muslim thinkers, I speak first, therefore, of Meccan da'wah as shorthand for da'wah from a position of relative powerlessness. Meccan da'wah tends to be persuasion-oriented and is often quietist in orientation. And here's an important point. Meccan da'wah, as I'm using it, is well suited to what I call settings of disestablishment, or maybe non-establishment or pre-establishment would also be worth using. So what do I mean by disestablishment? Disestablishment in my usage means situations in which religions lack or lose official government or assume societal backing, and therefore are forced to compete with one another in religious marketplaces. So obviously the counterpart then to Meccan da'wah would be what I call Medinan da'wah, which I use as shorthand for da'wah as religio-political summons. In other words, dawah from a position of relative or growing strength, or perhaps aiming at the attainment of power. Now, let me stress something very important. I use these last two terms strictly heuristically, and I try to pay attention to complexity both within and between them. So please just keep these preliminaries, these terms in mind as we now dive into the main part of the presentation. It is increasingly recognized that there has been a remarkable upsurge in missionary activism among Muslims over the past roughly 170 years. For all its vibrancy and diversity, much of this surge has coalesced under the term dawah, which we just defined. As dawah discourses and activities have increasingly proven their ability to mobilize Muslims on a mass scale, most contemporary denominations of Islam have taken up the challenge of dawah in one way or another. In fact, a number of the most significant movements in modern Islam were launched specifically with dawah in mind. Manifestations of dawah range widely, from traditional sermons in mosques to newer modes of street or marketplace preaching, from Quran translation and distribution programs to the production of Islamic novels and films, from the founding of private dawah societies and storefronts to departments of dawah in Islamic universities, from the emergence of Islamic websites, put that up on the screen, and Islamic televangelism to the popularization of the idea that the Quran anticipates the findings of modern science. From Muslim participation in interreligious dialogues and humanitarian relief projects to the recruitment activities of jihadi groups. It is truly no exaggeration to say that dawah is a major force in the contemporary Muslim world. Now, in organizing for dawah, Islamic movements have facilitated the involvement not only of scholars and elites, but also of Muslim laypeople in preaching and other forms of activism to a degree never seen before, thus contributing to the widely observed phenomenon of the democratization of religious knowledge and authority in modern Islam. While dawah is certainly not the only classical concept to have been energetically recovered and debated by Muslims in the modern age, one can think of concepts like ijtihad, islah, tajdeed, and of course, jihad. The extent to which missionary dawah has proven to be uniquely appealing is among the most arresting facts of modern Islamic history. In fact, many Muslim leaders have come to think of missionary dawah as perhaps the most appropriate jihad for this moment in history. This is all the more striking in light of the ways dawah was understood in pre-modern times. Up to the 1700s, the tasks associated with dawah and with Islamization more generally were carried out in fairly ad hoc ways. There were, in other words, few institutionally organized missionary outreaches of the sort that are so common in, say, the history of Christianity. As for the term dawah itself, it was used irregularly in pre-modern times. And when it was, it often had a political connotation. For instance, the invitation to join movements like the 8th century Abbasids or the 9th and 10th century Fatimids, or as seen in Islamic law, the invitation to Islam to be given before the commencement of battle. Indeed, before the modern period, dawah and Islamization often presupposed the establishment of public Islamic ambiances by Muslim rulers and states. Against this backdrop, the appeal and prevalence of missionary dawah in the modern era, and in particular of variations of what I call the Meccan pattern of dawah, are dynamics that call out for explanation. And that's what this talk is mainly about. Now, I divide the modern history of dawah into two phases. The first phase, circa 1850 to 1950, emerged out of the period of colonial modernity, when much of the Muslim world came under variations of non-Muslim, often European political and economic domination. The second phase, circa 1950 to the present, coincides with the period of post-colonial modernity. Although part 2 of my book covers both of these phases in some detail, in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to be focused simply on the first phase, because it is this phase which witnessed an unprecedented turn or return, perhaps, toward Meccan styles of dawah across the Muslim world. Although Medina styles never disappeared and have even made something of a comeback in the second phase, Meccan missionary dawah remains generally more widespread and prominent among Muslims worldwide up to the present. So while political Islamists and especially militant jihadi movements get a lot of attention in the media and academic circles, I suggest that this embrace of largely quietist, persuasion-oriented styles of missionary activism is in many ways the bigger story. Malik and Weissman, in an edited volume on Dawah, which came out about the same time as my book, basically agree. They write, despite the obvious importance of Dawah for the contemporary Islamic resurgence, academic research on the subject has not really taken off. Works dedicated to Dawah, works dedicated to Islamic activism, just like the general public, are focused on the spectacular deeds of the jihadis, more than on the long-term, low-pitched efforts of the dua. So let me illustrate what I mean by Meccan Dawah in the first phase. In the book, I provide dozens of examples of movements that emerged almost right around the same time, which adopted a similar approach to Dawah. In place after place, under the conditions of colonial modernity, reform-minded missionary movements emerged. And I'm just going to show you some here quite rapidly. For example, from the Murid movement of Ahmadu Bamba in West Africa, to the Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia, along with these two movements' large and active women's wings, Aisiyah and Muslimat NU. From the thought of giants like Abdu, Ridda, and Al-Kawakibi, to the early Muslim Brotherhood and Muslim Women's Association in Egypt, and I would stress the early Muslim Brotherhood. From Central Asian Jadidism, associated with Ismail Gerspinski, to the faith movement of Said Nursi in Republican Turkey. From the preaching and educational movement of Abdelhamid Ben Badis in Algeria, to Dawah initiatives among Muslim populations in Western countries. Finally, given its emergence in 19th century Iran, its resonances with Shiite Islam, and its focus on quietist missionary outreach, we might even include the rise of the Baha'i faith in the story we're telling here, as an example of this overall dynamic. While these movements were obviously quite different from one another, I argue that they all exemplify, in their own unique ways, turns to variations of what I call Meccan Dawah. Now, to see this more clearly and hopefully a bit more concretely, let's turn to the region I know best, South Asia. My work on modern Dawah has given a certain priority to the Muslims of South Asia because the evidence suggests that their turn to missionary Dawah in the colonial period was both pioneering and to some extent paradigmatic. For example, there was the Indian scholar Rahmatullah Kadernawi. Troubled by British domination of India and the aggressive activities of Christian missionaries, Kadernawi engaged in a literal marketplace debate with German missionary Karl Fander in Agra in 1855. A decade later, he published a Muslim critique of the Bible and defense of the Islamic scriptures entitled Izhar al-Haq, Revelation of the Truth. Kadernawi's book would go on to become a bestseller. As Muslims in other places came to face similar kinds of colonial dilemmas, it is not surprising that Kadernawi's efforts would resonate. Through the support of several Ottoman sultans, Kadernawi had Izhar al-Haq translated into multiple languages and widely published. Like many others, Rashid Ridda used and recommended Kadernawi's work in his own Dawah efforts in the early 20th century, a fact which illustrates the increasing interconnectedness of the Muslim world during what Gelvin and Green call the age of steam and print. Kadernawi's book continues to be used and widely available up to the present. Just as importantly, Kadernawi's efforts would serve as a model for many imitators, including South Africa's Ahmed Didat and India's Zakir Naik, both of whom claim to follow in Kadernawi's footsteps in engaging in a jihad of peaceful, if vigorous, religious marketplace Dawah. Just a few years after the publication of Izhar al-Haq, in 1867, the now world-famous Muslim seminary of Deoband was founded. Largely setting aside politics in the aftermath of the British defeat of the 1857 uprising, the early founders of Deoband quietly adapted British educational models in order to equip a new generation of Muslim scholars to bring Islamic reform to the masses. Today, there are thousands of Deoband-affiliated schools around the world, most of which adhere to the original pattern of what I call Deobandi Dawah, namely avoiding overt politics and instead providing education, fatwas, and literature to help Muslims follow Islam more faithfully. In its own historiography, the interreligious marketplace of colonial India plays a remarkably central role. Deobandi histories make much of the role of the school's ulama in defending Islam against Christian mission, as well against the proselytizing activities of the Hindu Arya Samaj and the Ahmadiyya movement. Speaking of the Ahmadiyya movement, Although considered heterodox by most Muslims, it is hard to overstate the importance of this movement in the history of modern Dawah. Founded in North India in 1889 by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the Ahmadiyya was among the first Islamic movements in the world to make missionary Dawah an explicit focus. Reckoning with the realities of British power and with interreligious competition, Ghulam Ahmad declared that the days of military jihad were over, and that now the true jihad would be that of missionary Dawah. Here then, in a late 19th century Islamic movement, a Meccan Dawahology is made a central point of practice. By the time of his death in 1908, Ahmad's movement had well-organized missionary programs and was spreading rapidly. This brings us to arguably the largest Dawah movement in the world today, the Tablighi Jamaat. Founded in the early 20th century by Maulana Muhammad Ilyas, the TJ, which focuses on grassroots spiritual formation and house-to-house preaching, is now active in well over 150 countries. Though he harbored dreams of the restoration of Islamic political power, Ilyas largely modeled his dawah on the Prophet's Meccan ministry, which he saw as analogous to the situation he was facing in colonial India. The success of the TJ's approach, as seen in the movement's eventual global popularity, is a powerful indicator of the pioneering role India's Muslims have played in developing these modes of activism. Now, among Ilyas's most important disciples was his biographer, Syed Abu Hassan Ali Nadwi, one of the 20th century's leading theologians of Dawah, who was directly and indirectly involved in dozens of Dawah initiatives around the world, including the Muslim World League and the Islamic University of Medina. In studying much of Nadwi's corpus, as I have, one can see that, like Ilyas, Nadwi mostly promoted a Meccan approach to Dawah throughout his long career. Many other Dawah movements emerged in the shadow of British colonialism in early 20th century India, some in direct imitation of the Tablighi Jamaat. Some were associated with the Deobandis' main Sunni rivals, the Barelvis and Ahl Hadith, as well as with Shiite groups. To this list, we could perhaps add the modernist Dawah of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and the early Dawah activism of Maududi and the Jamaat-e-Islami. All of these groups, in one way or another, were responding to the loss of Muslim political power, the presence of Christian and Hindu missionaries, and the Dawah activities of intra-religious Muslim rivals. So to return then to our original question, why Dawah? Or better, why was involvement in Dawah, especially in terms of what I've called Meccan varieties, such a significant avenue of Muslim activism in the first phase, and really one which continues right down to the present? And the answer to this question is that, not surprisingly, it's very complicated. So for the full answer, once again, I would encourage you to check out the book. But briefly, allow me to lay out my argument here as a thesis, which I will then elaborate on as we come toward the end of the talk. Here's the thesis. An ongoing mood of scripturalist reform combined with the transformations of the colonial period led to creative and dynamic Muslim recoveries of missionary Dawah as modes of activism both resonant with the Islamic past and well-suited to modern conditions. Now let me draw a couple key points from this. First, I believe the starting point for answering the question, why Dawah, should not be to look to factors external to Islam, as in the increasingly tired narrative of colonial crisis and Islamic reaction. Rather, there are good reasons to start with factors internal to the tradition itself. That's why in the book I begin with chapters on the Quran, the traditional biography of the Prophet or Sirah, and then with chapters on Dawah and Islamization in classical, medieval, and early modern Islam. We've already seen that the Quran and other early sources seem to assume a connection between Dawah and interreligious relations. We've also seen that the Sirah and Hadith, along with pre-modern Islamic history, provide precedents for what I've been calling Meccan and Medinan styles of Dawah. And this is a key point to keep in mind, because as I've already hinted, and as we will see further in just a moment, among its many other consequences, colonialism tended to foster a heightened awareness of religious pluralism. But another key point is the fact that before the onset of full-blown European colonialism, a widespread mood of reform was already stirring in the Muslim world from the 16th to the 18th centuries. Growing out of this mood, for lack of a better term, And out of Islam's more general disposition toward reform historically, several important movements emerged in this period which anticipated many aspects of the modern Dawah resurgence. And among the many I could have chosen, I'm just putting 3 up here on the screen. I'm not going to say much about them, but I just want to make a couple points. Despite their differences, the movements that you see on the screen were basically united in preaching against the supposedly wayward condition of Muslims. And they emphasized a return to scripture, especially hadith, as a solution. Though to differing degrees, each was also concerned about ordinary Muslims, whom they wanted to see brought back to what they understood authentic Islam. And that brings us finally to what I called earlier, the transformations of the colonial period. Most of us are already aware of the dramatic political reversals Muslim communities endured with the onset of colonialism. And so I'm not going to say much about that here. Certainly these political reversals, not to mention colonial meddling in education and indigenous economies, and the introduction of Western ideas and new technologies, were all major factors spurring modern Islamic thought and activism of every kind, including Dawah. One key point we should mention briefly, however, is that by the later part of the 19th century, colonial power seemed fairly entrenched. And this, in no small part, is what prompted Muslims around the world, Muslim leaders around the world, to feel that their situation was now more like the Prophet in Mecca and less like that of the Prophet in Medina, at least in a political sense. But you know, there's so much more to the story than just the loss of political power. Among other factors, we could highlight, for our purposes, a very important but often overlooked consequence of colonialism in the Muslim world was the widespread disestablishment, or at least felt disestablishment, of Islam, and an accompanying intensification of inter- and intra-religious competition. Although it is natural enough to assume that colonial policy, European colonial policy, must have not only disestablished Islam, but also favored Christianity. In fact, a more significant effect of European colonialism was to foster highly pluralistic environments in which, since no religion held a monopoly, each had to make a case for itself in the open marketplace. Colonial policies, in short, tended to facilitate the emergence of, quote, religion, in a newly reified sense, as a private domain of conscience and as an unregulated or selectively regulated spiritual marketplace. This recalls the sociological principle enunciated by Stark and Fink. To the degree that a religious economy is unregulated, they write, it will tend to become very pluralistic. And sure enough, the colonial period did witness an influx of new religious competitors into the former Muslim ecumene. The high modern or colonial period has been called the age of the voluntary society. And as it turned out, Western Christians were among the most active in forming non-state voluntary societies, including a whole host of new missionary societies throughout the 19th century. For instance, the Baptist Missionary Society was formed in 1792, the London Missionary Society in 1795, the British and Foreign Bible Society in 1804, the American Bible Society in 1816, and the China Inland Mission in 1865. Dozens of similar societies were set up in this period. Among Catholics, the Society of Missionaries of Africa, or White Fathers, was established in 1868 by Cardinal Charles Lavigérie, who was persuaded that French rule of Algeria had opened the door for Catholic mission to all of Africa. Once they reached their fields of service, these largely privately funded and privately supported missionaries built churches, schools, orphanages, hospitals, and publishing houses. As members of non-state voluntary associations then, many of the missionaries who planted themselves in the Muslim world took for granted a disestablishment marketplace model of religious advocacy. Missionary actors and organizations like these would not only challenge, but also provide models to Muslims and members of other religions, who would in turn develop missionary organizations, training centers, and presses of their own in this period. Contrary to the Western missionaries' hopes, therefore, one of the most enduring consequences of Christian mission in the colonial period was to stir up an urgent Muslim defense of Islam and a burgeoning of grassroots Dawah organizations, sometimes modeled precisely on those of the missionaries. Indeed, these dynamics generated what Niall Green has called a host of new religious entrepreneurs, firms, products, and communities well suited to disestablishment conditions. Further evidence for what I'm arguing here can be seen in the ways Christian missionaries are frequently referenced in a wide range of Muslim writings from the colonial period. Everywhere in the colonial Muslim world, Muslim writers and preachers spoke about the twin dangers of Western imperialism on the one hand and Christian mission on the other. And such ideas have continued to reverberate. To give just one example, I'm going to show you a quote from Maulana Muhammad Zakaria, arguably the most important theologian of the Tablighi Jamaat. Writing in the mid-20th century, he says the following, and here he's commenting on, again, Surat Al-Imran 104. He writes, God has commanded that from among the Muslims, a group should be set apart for the work of Tabligh. This command was given to all the Muslims, but we have completely neglected it. Permanent Jamaats of Christians have been set aside for the work of Christian Tabligh throughout the world. But is there any such Jamaat among the Muslims? One final piece of the puzzle needs to be added. All these factors taken together created a new urgency among Muslim religious leaders to reach ordinary Muslims and give them access to the sources of literate Islam. Moreover, as religions came to be reified as discrete systems and as Europeans began to enumerate people on the basis of such differences, the strength of Islam came to be regarded as a function of the numerical strength of the community. Because of this, ordinary people now had to be made conscious that they were, quote, Muslims, adherents of the, quote, world religion called Islam. This in turn required mass outreach efforts. All this prompted Muslim religious leaders and leaders of other religions to turn their attention to ordinary people. This, what I call turn to the masses, is among the most important features of modern Islamic thought and activism, a feature which would feed all the more into a new emphasis on Meccan styles of dawah. So let me wrap this up. At the dawn of the 20th century, the restoration of Muslim rule seemed a long way off. Many Muslims found themselves living under alien rule, largely deprived of worldly power and faced with unprecedented threats to their religion. It is in this overall context that many, drawing on the rich traditions of reform and renewal in Islam, began to seriously excavate missionary dawah from the Islamic past. If the strength of the colonial order seemed to foreclose explicit military or political resistance in the short term, if Islam was now disestablished to one degree or another, and if assertive religious competitors were a new fact of life, Muslims could still do jihad or struggle in the way of God through educational and missionary dawah in the religious marketplace. In such situations, Meccan approaches provided an attractive means whereby the attainment of political power could be deferred or simply left in the hands of God, and whereby Muslims could fulfill the spirit of jihad through peaceful, if vigorous, dawah activism. In an indirect way, this could in fact constitute a powerful form of resistance to colonialism in its own right. In fact, not only does such thinking permeate Muslim writings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but as we saw in the third section of this talk, this era also witnessed a burgeoning of new Islamic movements oriented precisely toward missionary dawah. To end then with a key point, these creative and dynamic Muslim recoveries of Meccan dawah proved to be both resonant with the Islamic past and well suited to the conditions of the first phase of modern dawah and beyond. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation starting now.
Great, great. Professor Kuiper, Matt, thank you so much for that presentation. Just, from the vantage point of the sorts of issues and questions that I think about, I think that your juxtaposition of da'wah with activism, I think really nicely challenges some often facile distinctions we draw between what's understood to be political activity that we might call da'wah or rather religious activity that we might call da'wah, and political activity that we tend to kind of rigidly categorize as something called Islamism, and the sort of fuzziness between these kinds of categories, particularly in post-colonial and eventually decolonial contexts. I have endless questions that I'd like to ask you, but I would love to open the floor to our audience. Please, you can join the conversation and pose a question to Professor Kuiper, either by typing it into the chat box, or by just using the raise hand function That's right there down in the reactions button on your Zoom control panel. I've already got one question that came in during the presentation. And so while others think of their questions, let me go ahead and also make sure our audience is aware of an event that we have coming up later now this month at the Ali Vural Ag Center. It's our annual conference on race and Islam. And my colleague Aishinur Sonmazkara put a link in the chat box to that event so you can get some more information about it. And we'd love to see you there. So please go ahead and register. So Matt, let me go ahead and put the first question to you. It comes from an audience member who is thinking about one issue that you already touched on in your historical presentation when you dealt with Christian missionary activity during the colonial period, but it's to invite you to more broadly compare and contrast da'wah as a mode of religious engagement from Christian missionary activity, and to ask what's at stake in making that kind of distinction.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Generally, in both of my writings on dawah, I've sort of tried to resist making those comparisons too quickly because it's easy to make them in a sort of simplistic fashion. As you saw in the presentation, as Professor Mandaville just said, certainly I see Christian mission, particularly in the colonial period, as one of the factors that helped to spur this rise in dawah activism, and then of course, even to some extent, when I spoke of the Christian voluntary society as a kind of model that then had some influence in terms of the kinds of missionary organizations and modalities that Muslims were developing, that's an important historical touch point as well. But I think the biggest thing I would highlight is I don't want to imply that you can simply draw a straight line from Muslim scripture straight to modern dawah, and I try to make that very, very clear. While I start my book with the Quran and Sirah of the Prophet, that's not therefore to imply that you can draw a straight line from those early precedents to modern practice. In many ways, modern dawah is a reinvention. It's a reinvention of something that exists in the sources, but I also am very keen to draw the points of continuity. So I'm getting around to answering your question by saying that I think the way we have to respect the way Islam thinks of itself as a missionary religion, and also respect the way Christianity or say Buddhism or others think of themselves as missionary religions, and how they draw on their own respective scriptures and early traditions and precedents in unique and different ways. So. Maybe I didn't totally answer the question, but that's maybe at least starting to answer the question.
Great, thanks very much. So let me go now to a question that came in through the chat box to someone who expresses appreciation for your presentation, but indicates that their microphone is broken. So the question is, I've specifically looked for the name of Jamaluddin al-Afghani throughout the lecture slides, but there was no reference to him, yet his considerable intellectual successors are mentioned, such as Rashid Rida, for example, you touched upon. Isn't al-Afghani the pivotal figure as being the precursor of the Islamic propagation and the modernization process? Isn't he sort of the pan-Islamist pioneer of the 19th and 20th centuries, the major influencer and during the colonial period, and therefore someone who whose work is relevant in the pan-Islamist context to your analysis of da'wah?
Yeah, thank you. That's where my my effort to sort of make this huge qualification at the beginning of the talk, which was I had to be extremely selective in the talk. There's a lot of things I was able to do in the book because it's a book that you can't do in a 30-minute talk. Afghani certainly is a very important and seminal figure in the history of modern dawah, and I probably should have at least included his name in the talk. You're right. When I was showing up all those different boxes around the colonial world, I probably should have added him there. Certainly very important, and I take that comment very much to heart. I also see there's a comment from the same question regarding the typo on the word dua. I just copied the quote exactly as it appeared in that book in Malik and Weissman's book, so that's why it appeared that way.
Okay, great, thanks. So we'll go now to a friend of the center, Professor Dietrich Rietz, who I saw popped up on the screen. Dietrich, please, do you have a question? I think you may be on mute, Dietrich.
Now, can you hear me?
We hear you now, yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, hi, I know Professor Kuiper also from our mutual engagement, therefore I'm happy to join this lecture and learn about the book. My question is, could you expand a little more about what you argue is the difference between the Mecca and Medina Dawa? And the other question I have is, you call a number of movements Dawa movements like the Muhammadiyah in Southeast Asia. I'm a bit skeptical about how to say this kind of direction of the terminology, because in the sense, I would argue Dawa or outreach or missionary activity is part of all these movements, but has it been a founding element to do the outreach, or is it just in inverted commas another religious movement that came up to spread religious education, which and religious knowledge, which in itself is not yet Dawa, because Deoband also makes a huge difference between, I mean, teaching a particular curriculum and then having very particular activities of outreach that they have defined very separately.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Rietz, and so nice to see you face to face. We've had many emailed correspondences, and your scholarship has had a huge impact on my own work on Dawa. So if you check the bibliography of my book, you'll see many, just to the whole audience, you'll see many citations to Professor Rietz. Regarding the Mecca-Medina distinction, I recognize that anytime you begin to use analytical categories in a kind of Weberian sense, there's the danger of distorting rather than enlightening. Yet I'm still a fan of using analytical categories because I think as long as you do it carefully, as long as you do it self-consciously and provide careful stipulative definitions, it still is really quite helpful on shedding light. As I was doing research on Dawa, I noticed a lot of Muslim thinkers themselves sort of drawing on this distinction, saying, what the Prophet did in Mecca is more what we're doing today. We don't have political power. We don't have these kinds of things. And so looking to the Meccan period, looking to the Meccan example of the Prophet Muhammad was something I was often encountering. And so that sort of led me to make this distinction. The definitions I provided at the beginning of the talk are more fully given in the book. But generally, Meccan Dawa refers to what I said, Dawa from a position of relative political powerlessness, in which, you're mainly, I don't want to say, what's the right word? You mainly have to rely on persuasion. You mainly have to rely on, the power of preaching and those kinds of modalities in order to propagate a new message. Medina Dawa, it may be a little tougher to define because the example of the Prophet leads in several different directions in Medina. Certainly the Prophet was continuing to do Meccan Dawa in Medina, so I don't want in any way imply otherwise. And so the Prophet's strictly religious mission continued in Medina, but then there was this new religio-political element as well. And you see that throughout Islamic history. I briefly cited the example of the Abbasid Dawa or the Fatimid Dawa, the Ismaili Dawa. These are all religio-political Dawas, to some extent resonant with what I'm calling Medina Dawa. And so in terms of modernity, Professor Mandaville mentioned Islamism. To some extent, I would consider their Dawas to be more on the Medinan side of things, where groups like the Tablighi Jamaat are more typically on the Meccan side of things. But again, I don't want to overstate this distinction, and I want to make sure you understand there's a lot of gray area between, both within and between, my use of Meccan and Medinan Dawa. As far as like labeling certain movements, Dawa movements, you're right. It can be a little bit of a challenging thing to do. I try to respect the movements themselves and not impose on them my own external categories too much. But where a movement does engage in significant amounts of both what I call internal or external dawah, through preaching, through education, through mobilizing, I think they basically qualify as dawah movements. You know, putting dawah in, as you said, in inverted quotes. And so that's the way in which I've done that in my research. Whether or not they use the term a great deal themselves, if they're doing the kinds of activism that broadly fit under the umbrella of dawah, then I've essentially counted them as being included. Hope that helps.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Kuiper. A question here in the chat box that just popped up. Why do you think that there is a strong thread of da'wah that emerged from the Indian subcontinent throughout the periods you described and is synonymous with da'wah, as opposed to the movements in the Middle East and North Africa regions that are somewhat difficult to define?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I do try to deal with that a little bit in some of my writings. In my first book, you know, I really do give a kind of pride of place to Indian Muslims, not because I think they were necessarily always the first, but in some ways, even in a chronological sense, you find Indian Muslims as sort of first to the gate in terms of, you know, facing, I think the 1857, the basically British defeat of the 1857 uprising was a key turning point, which led many Indian Muslims to embrace these sort of non-political, quietist, preaching-oriented modes of activism. The British East India Company began to allow Christian missionaries into India by 1813. Prior to that, they were, you know, trying to keep missionaries out because they were, of course, mainly there to do business and make money. But you know, so there was already these dynamics that I've highlighted. This you know, rise of interreligious competition, the dramatic and sudden loss of any sort of political power. Now, remember, ordinary Muslims in India weren't necessarily participants in the Mughal Empire or didn't have much say in you know, in Mughal rule, which was really an elite affair. But still, I think India's Muslims, in a sense, and when I say India, I mean British India, today's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, to some extent faced these things first and therefore pioneered some of the models that would then go on to make a global impact, like the Tablighi Jamaat, for example. I'm not an expert in the Middle East and North Africa, but you know, writing the second book gave me a chance to notice that there were similar things happening in those regions as well. But to some extent, maybe India's Muslims have a kind of pioneering or paradigmatic, you know, role to play in this period.
Great, thanks. I wanted to ask, if I could, about your reflections on kind of the phenomenon that we might think of as problematic as the term can sometimes be, the sort of neoliberalization of da'wah activity. You know, I first got interested in this when figures like Amr Khalid emerged in Egypt, right, who was consciously borrowing aesthetics and repertoires that were heavily dependent on kind of emerging forms of pop psychology discourse, you know, television formats that are more associated with entertainment. And so I'm just wondering, as we then move into the period of social media, you know, what does the impact of those, the intersection of da'wah work with those technologies, the stylings, the aesthetics, and the sort of cognitive styles associated with them, what impact does that have on da'wah and the way that da'wah is encountered and consumed?
Thank you. Excellent question. That's a topic that I take up in what I called in the talk the second phase of modern dawah, 1950 to the present. Certainly, you see the beginnings of what I call this turn to the masses in the colonial period. You see the beginnings of taking up tools like the printing press. You know, using what I like Gelvin and Green's book, The Age of Steam and Print, using those new technologies for the sake of these new modes of Islamic outreach. So I think that's where, in a sense, the watershed was turned. And then coming to the modern period, when you coming to the, you know, more recent times, when you have you know, new technologies like television, internet, audio and video cassettes, all those, because in a sense, that bridge had already been crossed in the colonial period. It was that much more easy to take those things up in what I would call the late modern or the postmodern period. Somebody like Ahmed Didat was a pioneer in using televangelism, using audio and video cassettes. His style is then picked up by many imitators, including someone who I've studied, Zakir Naik, Amr Khalid in Egypt. Has sometimes been compared to like the Oprah Winfrey of Egypt, although certainly in kind of a Dawa-oriented approach. So yeah, all these things I think relate to, going back to the colonial period, this sort of willingness to innovate and be entrepreneurial and embrace new technologies. And then also a second part would be the democratization, the turn to the masses, because one of the things I didn't get to say in the talk is that, when Muslim elites began to turn toward the masses in the colonial period and equip them to defend Islam in the religious marketplace, that was a double-edged sword. In a sense, the elites were turning over the keys to Islam to ordinary folks, who could then go on to become televangelists, like Zakir Naik. I mean, he didn't go to madrasa. He didn't, he's a medical doctor, or the Ahmed Didats of the world. So maybe I didn't totally answer your question, but those are just some of the reflections I would have based on what you said.
No, absolutely, Matt. My sense really is, my takeaway is that we need to have you back to do a presentation on the second half of the book. That'd be great. That's what I think. So we're rapidly reaching the end of the time we have together. So let me go back to Dietrich Rietz for what will be our last question today.
A small, maybe side note is that, or maybe you already talked about it more extensively in your book, two secular arguments that could be added to what you said. One is to develop the element of the establishment in a sense more, because it is perhaps the introduction of the Christian, the British education system that kind of devolved the Deobandi and other madrasa systems into something that they had not been before. They had been before also both religious plus secular education systems providing people for governance, whereas the British introduction of their system reduced them to the religious element. And it's only basically from then on that they became, so to say, only religious players in the field, which they had not been before. And the other point I wanted to stress also is that the element of ethnic and religious plurality in South Asia perhaps played an enormous role of distinction and difference, and explains also the high importance of outreach if you are competing in the field with the other religions and ethnicities for centuries, because until today it is of course remarkable that a minority Muslim regime was governing a majority non-Muslim society, which is in itself perhaps the explainer also for the importance of Dawah.
Yes, definitely. To your second point, that's all wrapped up in when I speak of disestablishment and the rise of religious marketplaces. Certainly, religious pluralism was not new to South Asia with the colonial period. But the idea of thinking of my religion as somehow, the reification of religion and thinking of my religion now as something that I have to make sure I understand as distinct from your religion. And my version of Islam as distinct from your version of Islam, if you're Ahmed, if you're Ahmadiyya, or if you're Shiite or something else, or I'm Deobandi, you're Ahl Hadith, I'm Deobandi, you're Barelvi. Those kind of distinctions became so much more important in the colonial period. And certainly that fed very strongly then into, what I kind of clunkily call religious marketplace mentalities, which then I think Dawah becomes a very fitting, very appropriate mode of outreach and mode of activism for precisely those kinds of contexts.
Great. Professor Kuiper, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. I want to draw your attention before we wrap up to some links that my colleague Aisha Noor has put in the chat box that will give you some information about upcoming events here at the Ali Vural Ag Center that we would love to see you at. First and foremost, though, I want to thank Professor Matt Kuiper for being with us today. Matt, it's a pleasure to hear from you and learn from you, and I sincerely hope that we'll be able to have you back in the future, so thank you.
Thank you, it's been great to be here. Thanks, everyone.
And of course, thank you to all of you who joined us today, and we hope to see you again soon at a future event here at the Ali Vural Ag Center at George Mason University. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.